It all starts on a Christmas Eve, with the street covered in snow and full of people enjoying the festive atmosphere. The city's atmosphere is joyful, with decorations shining everywhere. A family passes by together, and the little daughter celebrates that the day was the best ever. They walk happily, passing right by a lonely man who observes the scene. The little girl is amazed, looking around, enchanted by the lights. Juin observes the family and wonders why he always has to shrink to make way. Walking through the crowd, he finds it natural to be the only lonely person on that entire street. With that, the protagonist continues his path down the stairs towards the subway. But suddenly, he stops mid-walk. He notices something unusual and is surprised. Nearby, he realizes there is another person completely alone on that cold night. It's a Santa Claus kneeling in the snow, looking quite miserable. A sign asks to tell a wish to the old man, something Juin would normally ignore. However, being the exact date his parents died and left him alone, he decides to crouch down. Taking his wallet from his pocket, the young man takes out some money notes to donate to the stranger. Handing over the money, Juin offers the amount and comments that the note is still good. He carefully places the values inside the donation box. Surprisingly, Santa Claus grabs his hands tightly and thanks him for the enormous kindness. The old man insists that he wants to return the favor and demands to know what the young man's wish is. Thinking the man is crazy, the protagonist tries to break free from that bizarre grip. However, the strength in the stranger's hands is absurd, leaving Juin completely shocked. He tries to pull his arms in every way but cannot move a single centimeter. Santa Claus begs, explaining that he cannot return to his village until he grants the wish of a kind soul. Only wanting to get out of the situation, the young man agrees to say what he wishes if the man promises to let him go. Facing the old man, he finally begins to formulate his request. He asks to win the lottery, but the man sighs in disappointment and asks for a wish that comes from the bottom of his heart. Juin gets serious upon hearing that request. In a sincere outburst, he confesses that he needs a family that will always stay by his side and never abandon him. Holding the stranger's hand firmly, he details that he wishes for a very cute wife and daughter. The old man gets emotional, stating that he can feel the purity of that wish from such a lonely soul. Feeling very lucky, Santa Claus says he found someone with a soul similar to his. With a bizarre look, he promises to find a pure wife and a beautiful daughter who respects her father. Wishing him a life full of joy, the old man finally lets go of the young man's hands. Juin runs away immediately, cursing the guy as a complete lunatic. In the background, the man shouts that he will use all his power to grant the wish, leaving the protagonist quite scared. Shortly after, the subway train arrives at the station. Already inside the carriage, the young man holds onto the support bar to balance himself during the trip. He leans his head on his own arm, trying to understand what nonsense that crazy guy was talking about. Even thinking the guy is crazy, he reflects on the true reason for having revealed his greatest wish. Looking at a family advertisement on the train, he admits to himself that he just wanted to be happy too. Tired from the day, he simply closes his eyes to sleep a little. Suddenly, he smells a strange scent, feels an intense cold, and hears the sound of something shaking nonstop. Waking up confused, the protagonist gets up slowly, still a bit dizzy with everything. He opens his eyes startled, not understanding anything of what is happening. Instead of the subway, he is now inside a wooden carriage passing through a medieval village. Completely confused, Juin screams, asking where he is, realizing that he ended up locked in a cage in only his underwear. Beside him, he observes a man with long, dirty hair. The prisoner looks exhausted and in terrible condition. Looking around, the young man notices several men in the same situation and thinks he has returned to the Middle Ages. At this, he is left reactionless in the face of that madness. Trying to listen to the guards outside, the protagonist realizes that he doesn't understand a single word of their language. Upon noticing the medieval scenery and the lack of Asian people, he tries to process what is happening. Soon, the terrifying conclusion that he has fallen into another world hits his mind. Memories of him vanishing in the subway carriage quickly pass through his head. Shivering wildly from the cold, he curls up barefoot on the floor of the cage. Upon noticing a fallen prisoner, Juin realizes that the man is dead and decides to focus on his own survival. Apologizing to the corpse, he begins to strip the clothes off the dead man. With that, he puts on the dead man's shirt to try and warm himself up a bit. Now wearing the old clothes, he sits exhausted and remembers Santa Claus's promise about granting his wish. Lying on the filthy floor, the young man wonders if he totally misunderstood the meaning of happiness that the old man mentioned. Hoping that everything is a nightmare, he no longer even knows how many days have passed since he arrived in that place. The carriage continues moving non-stop along dirt roads in the middle of the forest. Huddled in the corner, the young man realizes that everyone inside is a slave, including himself. Observing the armed guards, he understands the reason why they are being taken from one side to another. The objective of that entire trip is to sell them as merchandise in different locations. Finally, the cage lock is opened. The soldiers line up the prisoners outside, while a village chief chooses the healthiest ones. Even though it hurts his pride to admit that he is a slave, the protagonist begins to feel a glimmer of hope. Knowing he has a good physique, Juin believes he will be bought quickly and will be able to escape from there. This becomes the first light at the end of the tunnel since he fell into that bizarre world. However, reality hits hard, and he sinks into despair after being rejected in several consecutive villages. The journey continues incessantly, passing through various camps. The carriage follows its path along the dirt road with the remaining prisoners. Thrown on the floor of the cage, he is completely devastated, not understanding how his life reached rock bottom. Remembering his mother's advice to live to the fullest, the young man wonders if there is still any reason to stay alive. Remembering his childhood, Juin still tries to process if that wish talk was really true. Thrown on the floor of the cage, he questions his deceased parents if he will be able to endure that miserable situation. In his mind, the old man's promise to use all his power to grant his request echoes. Angered by that nonsense about happiness, he tells both worlds to go to hell. Clenching his fist tightly, the young man concludes that the only thing that matters at that moment is not a romantic wish. At this, he hits the bars, thinking that true peace would be to die and escape all the pain. However, he soon steps back hurt, admitting to himself that this is not the way out. Deep down, the protagonist just doesn't want to die in a hole like that without forming a family. Completely desolate, he just accepts his deplorable reality in heavy silence. Suddenly, a hand appears and extends a piece of bread towards him. Raising his head, the young man sees a very kind woman outside the cage offering the food. She says something he cannot understand, but the attitude leaves him quite surprised. Right behind her, a very cute little girl observes the situation somewhat timidly, holding onto the bars. Even without speaking the language, the protagonist is left speechless by the kindness of those two. The scene then cuts to a small and peaceful wooden cabin isolated in the middle of the forest. Inside the house, the woman and little Lizzie are sitting at the table having a simple meal. The little girl eats her soup very politely, holding the bowl with both hands. Wanting to take good care of the child, the mother pushes a plate with more food towards her. Lizzie remains silent observing the food while her stomach lets out a loud growl. Knowing that her mother is hungry, the girl refuses the offer so that the woman can eat. But the mother insists gently, ensuring that the child needs that food as much as she does. With much affection, she slides the plate slowly back across the table. She tries to convey safety, affirming that the two will overcome the difficulties together. At that moment, loud knocks on the door cut the mood, with the village chief calling from outside. The woman hugs Lizzie in a jump, while the man warns that the council has decided to force her to marry one of the slaves. In shock, the resident hears the order that she must take the stranger to the mountains the next day. The elder warns her to prepare food and meet the soldiers at dawn, leaving shortly after. In the dark of the cabin, the woman panics, terrified at the chance of going back to being beaten by a husband. Trembling with dread, she recognizes that there is no way to escape from that village in the middle of nowhere. Observing the sleeping girl in her lap, she decides she could never abandon the little one. Clenching her chest, the woman feels she has no right to leave the child alone in the world again. A painful memory of Lizzie with tears in her eyes invades her mind. The memory of the little one's desperate crying simply breaks the mother's heart. At that time, the poor little girl would be completely isolated and sobbing on the floor. Remembering her own youth, the resident recalls the terrible fear of not knowing what her future would be. Huddled in a corner of the house, she suffers deeply just thinking about reliving that whole nightmare. Still, the sadness lessens a bit when she looks at her daughter. Seeing Lizzie hugging a teddy bear, she understands that abandonment hurts both of them the same way. This little 5-year-old orphan lost her father tragically and didn't even have a name until recently. Inevitably, the woman remembers the day her own father sold her for a rabbit pelt. As soon as she stepped into the village, her former husband beat her mercilessly before she could even unpack. The man kicked her violently just because she took a little longer than expected to arrive. Assaulted over a trifle, it dawned on her that that cursed life was just beginning. Fallen on the floor and full of bruises, the harsh reality crushed her spirit completely. But it was exactly in that terrible moment that a small child quietly approached. Devastated on the wooden floor, the young woman slowly raised her eyes to understand what was happening. In that true hell, the pure and worried look of little Lizzie shone towards her. Without saying a word, the little girl simply lay down next to the injured body to keep her company. This little girl with the manner of an angel was the only one to show the slightest bit of compassion in the entire village. Curiously, the violent husband left for the mountains that day and never showed his face again. Soon the rumor spread that the aggressive man had become wolf food during a hunt. Despite the immense relief of learning of his death, a new kind of despair took hold of the widow. She knew very well how that despicable society worked. Surviving without a husband to bankroll her status left her totally unprotected from everyone. Starting to live alone, the two walk through the village feeling the weight of abandonment and danger. Back in the present at the entrance of the village, they hear the sound of wheels approaching. With an innocent air, the little one excitedly points to the huge carriage arriving at the place. The two attentively watch the vehicle stop in the middle of the dirt road, raising dust. Driven by curiosity, the resident decides to go over there to take a closer look. It is exactly like this that she comes face to face with Juan caged like an animal. The young man's deeply exhausted and desperate look has a strong and immediate impact on her. In that fraction of a second, the terrible memory of her husband beating her for being useless comes rushing back. Reliving the hair pulls and angry screams sends a chill straight down her spine. The threatening shadow of that cruel man still terrorizes her thoughts daily. Facing someone as broken as she once was, the woman's eyes begin to tear up. She can see in the protagonist the same silent suffering that she and her daughter endured in the past. Acting on pure instinct, the resident takes a small bread from inside her straw basket. With the child by her side, the two go to the carriage, being careful of the soldiers. Through the iron bars, the woman extends the food towards the starving slave. Completely surprised, Juan freezes at that gesture of compassion in such a dark world. But the peace is short-lived, as men from the village approach wanting to know if the prisoners have arrived. The elder orders the woman to return home immediately, taking over the reception of the soldiers. Unable to disobey the order, the mother calls her daughter, and the two turn their backs to the cage. Before leaving for good, the sweet little girl gives one last look at the imprisoned man. Holding the bread firmly in his hands, the young man watches the family walk away with a mix of sadness and hope. Quickly devouring the bread, Juan tries to kill his hunger inside the cage. But the small meal is interrupted when the guards open the door yelling aggressively. At this, the young man is pulled out of the carriage without the slightest care. He ends up falling face first onto the ground and drops the food, his stomach growling loudly from weakness. Taken to an open field, the village leader begins to give instructions to the soldiers. Suddenly, the guards draw their swords and surrender the slaves who are kneeling on the grass. Using the blade, one of the soldiers cuts the ropes binding a prisoner's hands. Right after, he activates a kind of magical contract that glows intensely in the air. Totally exhausted, the protagonist just sighs, not understanding what kind of world he has ended up in. Further ahead, a guard approaches another older slave to start the process. Juan remains kneeling on the ground, waiting his turn passively. In silence, he just observes the movement around him. The scene cuts to a peaceful view of the trees swaying near the wooden village. A large bag of supplies is left on the ground, with the order that it must be taken to the cabin. The woman hears from the elder that she will have to pay for everything later, since the village will fund the initial supplies. The elder woman is quite direct in commenting that the whole village hated the man who died. She hopes the new partner will be different, believing he might just be a commoner. Sitting on the floor with her daughter, the mother hears that the stranger has soft hands like a noble's. Holding the young woman's hands, the old lady guarantees that someone like that has never hit anyone. A bit more relieved, the woman thanks her and says she doesn't need much to live well. She confesses that her only hope is that this man is not aggressive. Hugging little Lizzie in bed, the resident accepts that it's enough for him to just leave them in peace in some corner. Suddenly, very loud knocks on the cabin door cut through the morning silence. The woman wakes up startled and jumps up, squeezing the little girl in her arms. At this, the wooden door is thrown open violently, causing a great surprise. The village chief appears at the entrance announcing that he finally brought the promised husband. Quite tense, she simply agrees with the elder's order to bring the man inside. Juin walks through the door totally disoriented, trying to understand where the hell he ended up. The chief pushes the young man in annoyance, complaining about the delay in entering the house. Huddled on the floor, the woman tries to absorb that this stranger will be her husband. Observing the young man's size, she is quite intimidated by his presence in the room. Soon, Juin also focuses his attention on the two figures huddled in the corner. He quickly recognizes that she is the same person who offered him food earlier. However, the protagonist soon realizes that the woman is trembling greatly with fear. Lacking patience, the village chief shoves the young man's back, demanding an attitude. With a violent pull, the elder drags him directly closer to the resident. He places the two side by side in a rather clumsy way. Complaining about the couple's clumsiness, the old man grabs their hands without any warning. With a quick movement, the leader forcefully joins the hands of the young man and the woman. Satisfied with the result, the man laughs and states that now they look like a real couple. Juin is very confused by the mood of the situation, since he doesn't understand a single word of the language. The bizarre memory of Santa Claus promising a pure wife and an obedient daughter invades his mind. Looking at the scared young mother, he imagines her as a small and harmless rabbit. Next, he observes the little girl and compares her to a small, defenseless hamster. Standing there holding the woman's hand, it finally dawns on him that the crazy old man kept his promise. Facing that incredibly fragile family, he admits that the wish has come true. But the memories of the hell he went through trapped in the cage return to haunt his thoughts. The young man clenches his fists, finding it totally unnecessary to have been thrown into another world like that. Overcome by immense fury, he promises to kill that Santa Claus if he ever meets him again. His murderous and angry aura deeply frightens the woman and little Lizzie. Later, Juin accompanies the leader and an older hunter on a trail through the forest. Walking right behind, the young man is already going crazy from not understanding absolutely anything they say. Suddenly, the older hunter stops walking and turns towards the protagonist. The man extends his hand in a friendly gesture, leaving the stranger a little surprised. Believing it to be a common greeting, the young man returns it and holds the villager's hand. However, the man squeezes with an absurd force, making Juin question if that is the local way of saying hello. Soon, the protagonist notices the malice in the hunter's look and understands that he is being tested. At this, he decides to squeeze back with much more force, making the guy scream in despair. The hunter falls to his knees crying in pain, feeling the bones in his own hand almost break. After letting go of the man, Juin observes the guy agonizing on the grass while the elder keeps talking. Still trembling, the hunter hands a simple wooden bow to the young man. With the weapon in hand, Juin finds the attitude strange, but concludes they don't want to fight. The villager points into the woods and makes a bizarre gesture with his hands on his head. Crouching on the dirt, the man imitates a jumping animal, embarrassing himself a lot in front of the two. Understanding the ridiculous pantomime, the protagonist deduces he needs to learn to hunt rabbits. Suddenly, the hunter grabs the stranger's shoulder firmly to get his attention. Pointing agitatedly at the vegetation, he indicates that he found the perfect target. Hidden amidst the leaves, a cute and fluffy white rabbit peacefully chews the grass. The man orders him to shoot right away, leaving the young man tense for never having used a bow in his life. Kneeling on the ground, he positions the arrow, wondering how he will hit something so small. Concentrating all his strength, Juin pulls the bowstring to the limit, focusing on the animal. The arrow is fired with impressive speed, passing straight through the rabbit and violently piercing the ground. The hunter and the young man are left open-mouthed at the damage caused by the absurd impact. Totally in shock, the protagonist stares at his own hands, trying to understand what crazy strength that was. Meanwhile, in the cabin area, the woman and little Lizzie anxiously wait for the man's return. Surprised by the damage he did, Juin keeps staring at his own display of strength in disbelief. A bit awkward about the whole situation, he just scratches his face trying to hide the absurdity that just happened. At this, the young man observes the woman approaching with little Lizzie and reflects that she is now his wife. His heart gives a slight flutter as he faces this new and fragile reality head-on. The hunter remains terrified in the background, while the family just watches the scene from afar without understanding anything. Later, the three sit together on a towel in the forest to have a quiet meal. Juin devours the food quickly, under the attentive and silent gazes of the woman and the little girl. Holding the bowl of stew, he focuses on recovering his energy after so much stress in the cage. While the protagonist eats eagerly, the resident eats in a much more restrained and timid manner. Finishing the meal, she wipes her mouth politely, making the young man pause his own to observe. He remains silent for a moment, just analyzing the company of those two. Soon, a feeling of calm takes over his chest in the face of that peaceful scene. Spending some time there with them, the young man admits that the word family has always been a strange thing in his life since adolescence. However, he reflects that a whole family was practically handed on a silver platter to a lonely guy like him. Logically, it would be better if everything had happened naturally, but given the crazy circumstances, he thinks the order of factors doesn't matter as much. Sighing heavily, the protagonist admits he feels like killing that Santa Claus, but at the same time feels gratitude. Resting on the grass, he mentally thanks the old man for keeping the bizarre promise of Christmas Eve. After this short break, their routine begins to move at a very fast pace along the trail. Carrying the heavy sacks of supplies, Juin walks ahead and wonders if the two are managing to keep up. Right behind, the woman and little Lizzie walk panting, clearly exhausted by the long journey. Seeing their fatigue, the young man gets very frustrated that he can't even ask if they are okay because of the language. Determined to change this, he promises himself that he needs to adapt to this world as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the stranger stops firmly in the middle of the dirt road. An old memory of his mother surfaces, teaching him that he should never hesitate when there is someone to protect. In the bright memory, she guarantees that a son must act immediately the moment he feels that desire to care. Motivating himself with this memory, Juin looks over his shoulder towards his new family. Without thinking twice, he turns around and walks straight towards the tired woman and child. Seeing the giant man approaching, little Lizzie is terrified and lets out a whimper of fear. Trying to be as gentle as possible, the young man crouches in front of the little girl, asking her not to be scared of his approach. The girl's mother goes into complete shock, fearing that something aggressive is about to happen. Acting on pure protective instinct, the woman steps in front of her daughter, saying something desperately to try to stop the stranger. Hiding behind her mother, the little girl trembles and cries softly, thinking they are going to get beaten. Seeing the absolute panic of the two, the protagonist understands he shouldn't have approached with such a serious expression. Very calmly, he asks for permission for a moment as he advances towards them. In a quick and careful movement, Juin picks up little Lizzie in his arms. Immediately after, he wraps his other arm around the mother, lifting the young woman off the ground without any difficulty. Now the young man carries the heavy sacks of supplies on his back and his entire family in his arms. Standing in the middle of the trail supporting all that weight, he shows no sign of physical effort. Settled in his lap, the little one widens her eyes, completely confused by the big guy's attitude. On the other side, the woman is also left reactionless, not understanding why she is being carried this way. Showing tranquility, the protagonist just tells the two to hold on tight. He resumes walking through the forest as if it were nothing, finding the weight of those two absurdly light. Bothered by the family's thinness, he concludes that he needs to learn to hunt fast to feed them with meat. Observing the woman's face so close, Juin realizes he will have a gigantic job ahead to keep them all well. Feeling the safety of that welcoming embrace, the resident slowly rests her head on his shoulder. She clutches the fabric of the young man's shirt tightly, finding a comfort there she never imagined having. Nestled in her new husband's arms, the young woman watches him silently with a much more serene look. The walk continues peacefully along the trail, following the village elder towards their new home. Finally, they arrive at the isolated cabin, with the chief saying goodbye and thanking them for the escort. The old man turns his back and walks away, leaving the new family alone in front of the simple residence. Evaluating the deplorable state of the wooden house, the young man fears that it is even colder there than his old rented room. A memory of him with chattering teeth from the cold in winter emerges, reinforcing how much he hates low temperatures. Putting his worries aside for a moment, he places his hand on the rustic doorknob. Upon pushing the door to enter, Juin lets out an exclamation of surprise at what he sees inside. Right behind him, the woman enters the cabin and is completely paralyzed with shock. Confused by her intense reaction, the protagonist immediately asks the reason for those sudden tears. Unable to hold back, the resident runs straight past him towards the interior of the house. The young man follows her rushed movements, without understanding absolutely anything of what is going on. Standing at the entrance, he observes the empty environment trying to process the magnitude of the problem. He then discovers that the villagers invaded the place and stole absolutely all the furniture and survival tools. Anguished by the cowardly looting, the protagonist concludes that there is no way to fix the house or defend against wild beasts. Going out to the backyard of the property, he finds his wife thrown on the forest floor. Seeking to offer some comfort, Juin sits quietly next to her on the grass. With great delicacy, the young man extends his hand and begins to stroke the woman's head. Caressing her brown hair, he tries to calm the crying of someone who just lost everything. Looking into her eyes, he gently asks the young woman not to worry about the situation. Crying a lot, the resident feels he is trying to reassure her and reflects on this strange partner. She thinks about the immense difficulty of not even being able to communicate properly and his lack of hunting skills. The doubt about whether they will be able to survive together in that cruel place consumes the young mother's mind. However, the soft and confident expression on the young man's face breaks all the tension of the tragic moment. Opening a very welcoming smile, Juin sincerely promises that he will protect her from everything. Even anxious and full of fears about tomorrow, she surrenders to his affection receptively. A tear slides down her face as a comforting feeling takes over her wounded heart. Bathed in the late afternoon light, the young man wipes his wife's face with the utmost tenderness possible. In the face of so much care coming from a stranger, she completely relaxes and wonders why she feels so relieved by his side. The protagonist hugs the young woman while reflecting on his original world, remembering that he lived completely alone since his parents passed away. Even with all this loneliness and difficulty, the young man fought hard and endured everything just to keep surviving. Analyzing the new situation, he understands that he now has a family, and there is no reason not to be able to withstand the challenges. To convey security, Juin guarantees that she doesn't need to worry, promising to do whatever is necessary to support them. Not understanding the words, the young woman just cries softly as she leans on his shoulder. Suddenly, a loud noise in the bushes catches the young man's attention, who turns his face confused while the woman remains in his arms. In a desperate leap towards them, the little girl stumbles and cries bitterly, begging in her own language for the big guy not to hurt her mother. The little one throws herself against the stranger's leg, holding on tightly and trying to protect the woman with all her childish strength. Surprised by the child's attitude, the protagonist stands still on the forest floor, just observing the two crying near him. Facing the scene, he thinks how surreal it is to have a woman in tears seeking comfort in his arms so suddenly. Added to this, a little girl cries clinging to him trying to defend her mother, making this whole situation extremely unfamiliar to the young man. Full of doubts in his head, he questions himself whose child this is, and for what reason that resident decided to offer him bread earlier. With great delicacy when wiping the tears from her face, the man also wonders what made her collapse in tears like that. But leaving the uncertainties aside, Juin believes that if they continue living together and put in the effort, they will certainly form a good family. Holding the young woman tight in a protective hug, the young man promises in his thoughts to make them very happy, swearing to become a good husband and a good father. Still in the middle of the forest, he swears to himself that neither of them will ever regret having become his family. Sometime later, the sun begins to set on the horizon, bathing the old isolated wooden cabin with a golden light. Already inside the residence, the three sit on the floor in an atmosphere of absolute silence, separated by a considerable distance. Juin sighs in frustration, thinking they had gotten closer after the crying, but now realizes they are back to square one. Seeing the two staring at him huddled up, he feels relieved that they are just cautious instead of terrified, but has no idea how to break the ice. At this, a simple idea pops into the protagonist's mind, who raises his index finger excited about the solution. The young man quickly adjusts his posture on the wooden floor, giving the woman and child a little scare with the sudden movement. Pointing directly to his own chest, he shows himself to be friendly and introduces himself by saying his name Kim Juin clearly. Pausing the syllables well, he repeats the pronunciation to make it easier, concluding that they at least need to know each other's names to live together. Realizing the stranger's intention, the young woman repeats his name in a very timid and drawn-out way, trying to get the strange pronunciation right. Satisfied with the success, Juin extends his hand towards her and gently asks the resident to reveal what her name is. The woman hesitates for a brief moment, looking away as she thinks about how to respond to her husband's interaction. Shortly after, she points her index finger to her own chest and finally pronounces the name Lizzie for the young man. The protagonist shows a lot of satisfaction with the progress and praises the sound of the name, even knowing she doesn't understand the full sentence. Turning his attention to the little one huddled in the corner, the big guy points to her wanting to know what the child is called. Faced with the question, Lizzie lowers her head completely in silence, leaving the young man confused by the sudden change in the room's atmosphere. The little girl also shrugs her shoulders with a sad expression, leading Juin to ask in shock if she still doesn't have a name. The mother keeps her gaze downward, confirming the suspicion that the little one has grown up until now being called whatever. Reaching out his arm, the protagonist gently touches the child's cheek and announces that he himself will give her a name, choosing to call her Dorothy. The girl stares at the big guy with shining eyes, hearing the word Dorothy sound welcomingly in the small room. The young man based his choice on the Wizard of Oz character, a girl who goes on adventures with various friends and finds her own happiness. With this simple gesture, he wishes from the bottom of his heart that the little one becomes an adorable child and has a bright future. Still a bit uncertain about the novelty, the little girl repeats the name slowly, testing how the word sounds in her own voice. As soon as the sound comes out, Dorothy shows immense joy, adopting her new identity with a lot of excitement. The next day, the silence of the forest is broken by the loud sound of Juin's axe chopping wood outside the cabin. Observing the scene from afar, Lizzie crosses her arms and reflects that this stranger is indeed a very strange man. She notices that, even though he has a much larger and scarier body than her late husband, the big guy treats her with extreme kindness instead of aggression. The young woman concludes that this new partner is a completely different person from all the cruel residents she has ever known in her life. Murmuring the young man's name softly, she admits she doesn't understand his language, but notices that his pronunciation is refined and his voice has an unusual calmness. Pulling up the difficult memories of the past, the woman realizes she had never received a drop of kindness from anyone before his arrival. While the young man watches her amicably in the middle of his work, Lizzie remains intrigued about why he is so good. Shaking her head, the resident realizes that no matter how much she tries to understand, this stranger clearly doesn't belong in that rustic place. Interrupting her thoughts, Juin waves his free hand and calls her by her name in a very animated way. The young woman focuses her gaze on the man's face, paying close attention to the dark color of her new partner's hair and eyes. At this, an old piece of gossip crosses her mind, recalling that it was said that an enemy nation at war managed to summon a legendary hero. The legend described that this mythical warrior possessed deeply black hair and eyes, a striking and terrifying characteristic. Finishing putting away the wood, the protagonist walks towards his wife with a very relaxed posture. Staring at his features, the woman cannot ignore that the descriptions of this dangerous hero somewhat match the stranger. However, she soon discards this crazy theory, affirming to herself that someone so powerful would never be lost on that mountain. She deduces that a true hero would live surrounded by luxury in a grandiose palace, and not taking care of firewood in a miserable village. When the young man gets very close, Lizzie notices that his hair is not dark like the night, but rather a shade leaning towards brown. Looking closer at the big guy's eyes, she realizes the color also doesn't fit the terrible war legends she heard. The resident lets out a sigh of relief upon concluding that he is just an ordinary man, albeit much larger than normal peasants. Confused by her own feelings, she wonders why she feels so relieved with this silly discovery. After all, the two met just today, there being no reason for her to care so much about his true identity. Pushing the doubts from the woman's head, Juin reaches out his arm and begins to affectionately stroke the top of her head. The sudden physical contact catches her by surprise, making the resident freeze since she is not used to this kind of treatment. The young woman remembers that the only reason a man's hand ever approached her face in the past was always to deliver a cowardly blow. The protagonist continues stroking his wife's brown hair, using slow and comforting movements under the afternoon sun. Surrendering to that pleasant feeling, Lizzie closes her eyes heavily, admitting deep in her soul that she wants more of that. With her heart racing, the woman just stands there receiving the touch, praying silently that he never stops caressing her. The young man lowers his face to look at her better, with his cheeks slightly flushed given the silent proximity between the two. Slowly raising her gaze, Lizzie shows a completely surrendered expression, with her eyes shining with enchantment for her new husband. Totally enveloped by the magical atmosphere of the forest, their bodies naturally attract and they finally join their lips. The touch happens in a simple and direct way, sealing the promise of care and affection that Juin made since arriving in that world. But right after, the protagonist jerks his face back, with his eyes wide and his face burning with shame. The shock of reality hits the stranger hard, leaving him completely paralyzed and in panic at his own impulsive attitude. Turning his face away, the young man stammers some disconnected syllables, unable to look his wife in the eye after the unexpected kiss. Desperate to escape that enormous embarrassment, he turns around quickly and runs towards the work equipment. Giving no explanation, Juin grabs the handle of a wooden bucket tightly, looking for any excuse to flee the place immediately. The protagonist dashes towards the forest carrying the bucket, fleeing as fast as he can from that embarrassing situation. Left behind, Lizzie holds her hands against her chest, totally shocked, and with her face burning with shame at his sudden attitude. Already amidst the trees, the big guy walks mentally cursing himself for doing such a crazy thing, worried about the image his wife now has of him. He slaps his hand on his own forehead, remembering that even though they are married, the two just met that very day. Besides not even being able to communicate properly, the young man is completely at a loss for what to do and considers simply pretending nothing happened. But suddenly, he stops walking halfway through the path. Looking around, Juin realizes that the landscape has completely changed, becoming confused about how far he walked and where exactly he ended up. The surrounding forest becomes much denser and darker, with the sound of the wind blowing through the trees creating a very scary atmosphere. Trying to stay calm, the stranger decides to just get some water quickly and return straight to the cabin. At that moment, he gets a huge scare upon noticing a sinister presence right there. Emerging from the dark bushes, an enormous creature with black fur blocks his path. The animal reveals itself to be a gigantic wolf with sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. Growling aggressively, the beast makes the young man take a step back, totally frozen with fear. He stares at that absurd predator, feeling a chill down his spine upon noting the unreal size of the beast. Unable to even react, the stranger falls to his knees on the ground, dropping the bucket, paralyzed in the face of imminent death. Seeking any chance to survive, Juin quickly grabs a thick branch that was lying on the ground beside him. Without wasting time, the wolf lunges with everything, opening its giant jaw to devour the prey. Using the piece of wood as a shield, the young man manages to block the bite heading straight for his neck. He screams desperately while straining to keep the beast's teeth away from his face. With a loud snap, the wood cannot withstand the brutal pressure and breaks in half. Taking advantage of the opening, the wolf sinks its fangs into the protagonist's left arm, who curses, feeling an unbearable pain. Even wounded, he refuses to give up and screams, asking if the beast thinks he is just going to die there. Preparing a punch with his free arm, the stranger furiously states that he is definitely not going to lose his life no matter what. The blow hits the animal's face squarely, but the impact ends up hurting the young man's own hand. Clenching his teeth in agony, Juin feels as if his entire body is burning. Suddenly, he opens his eyes, shocked at what has just happened. An intense and bright flame appears out of nowhere right between him and the wild animal. Looking at his own right arm, the young man sees that it is completely engulfed by a mysterious fire. Scared by the sudden heat, the beast lets go of his arm and retreats in a quick jump. The wolf howls in pain as it tries to deal with the burns left on its snout by the burst of flames. On impulse, the protagonist pushes his burning arm forward, firing a blast of fire that completely swallows the beast. Shortly after, the giant wolf falls lifeless on the forest floor, its body charred and smoking. Juin collapses backwards on the grass, totally exhausted, trying to process what just happened after seeing his own arm catch fire. He raises his right hand and observes his skin with close attention. Noticing that his clothes are intact and without any burns, the young man begins to suspect that he might have used some kind of magic. At this, he remembers that falling into another world and gaining powers is a very common cliché in fantasy novels. Imagining that classic scenario of heroes and mages, the stranger thinks the situation fits perfectly into it. Staring at the palm of his hand, he decides to do a practical test in case this absurd theory is true. Pointing his arm upwards with confidence, Juin shouts, invoking a fireball. He repeats the command several times in different poses throughout the forest, but absolutely nothing happens. Lying on the grass again, the young man tries to send firestorms and walls of flames into the air. Facing the dead wolf, he even resorts to dragon breath and invocations of earth spirits in search of any spark. After trying so much, the big guy gets a bored look on his face, realizing he is making a fool of himself alone. But looking at his left arm, he concludes it wasn't an illusion, as the wounds from the bite healed a bit thanks to this mysterious power. Excited by the discovery, he imagines that if he manages to use this magic freely, he can hunt and provide a much more plentiful and happier life for his new family. Lying there, Juin also thinks he will be able to treat any of their illnesses with magic, since there is no doctor in that isolated village. Jumping up from the ground, he decides not to rush and to analyze this whole situation more calmly. However, painful memories invade his mind, recalling the time when his grandfather died in a bizarre accident shortly after his parents' deaths. At that time, the relatives physically assaulted him during the mourning period, throwing all the blame for the tragedies onto him. Being humiliated on the floor, the boy had to listen to his uncle's claim that the family only died because they lived near him. Surrounded by the adults' hatred, the young protagonist silently accepted being pointed out as the cause of all the misfortunes. Back in the present, the stranger gets a melancholy look as he remembers being treated like a true deadly plague when he was still in high school. Pushing those bad memories away, he grabs the wolf's leg, deciding to focus on the present to prevent other beasts from smelling the blood. Throwing the immense carcass over his shoulders, the young man concludes that he can at least skin the pelt before returning home. Walking with that absurd weight on his back, he mentally gives thanks for the fact that his grandfather had taught him how to slaughter chickens and rabbits in the past. Under the light of the full moon, Juin feels an enormous peace, imagining how proud the old man would be to see him handling the situation so well. While making his way back, the big guy racks his brain again, trying to figure out how he is going to train these magical abilities. Far from there, the atmosphere inside the small wooden cabin remains very warm and welcoming near the wood stove. Preparing dinner quite excitedly, Lizzie asks in a very affectionate way for the little girl to hand her a bowl. As soon as the little one fulfills the request, the woman says thanks using the new name Dorothy very naturally. Earning a sweet head scratch, the girl agrees, all happy and proud to be helping her mother in the kitchen. She runs excitedly around the room, but suddenly stops upon noticing a strange movement outside. Curious, the child leans on the edge of the wooden window to peek into the darkness of the forest. Dorothy squints, trying to see what is approaching in the middle of the night. Suddenly, the terrifying head of the giant wolf appears right at the window, making the girl let out a deafening scream of terror. The little girl runs backward, crying in despair, believing that the monster outside is about to invade the house. Hearing her daughter's panic, Lizzie doesn't think twice and grabs the kitchen knife she was using on the counter. Wielding the weapon, the woman runs towards the child, telling her to get away from the window as fast as possible. However, looking outside, the young resident is completely shocked by what she finds. Emerging from the shadows, Juin finally arrives at the cabin's backyard, carrying that immense carcass on his back. Believing her husband is being attacked, Lizzie screams desperately as she runs towards the exit. She crosses the house door, calling for the big guy, who throws the dead body of the animal onto the yard floor. Seeing that the beast was already dead and the stranger was not in danger, the woman freezes in her tracks with the little girl hiding behind her back. Lizzie stands static, holding the blade, unable to process the fact that he slaughtered a monster like that completely alone. Faced with such shock, her fingers relax and the knife falls to the dirt floor, making a metallic sound. Holding Lizzie's shoulders gently, Juin tries to calm her down by affirming that everything is fine and he didn't suffer any serious injuries. Little Dorothy approaches, crying a lot, and tightly grabs the big guy's leg. He looks into his wife's eyes and guarantees that he only took a bite on the arm and is already completely healed. Now sitting on the lawn, the stranger hugs the two, reassuring the family and asking them not to worry. Suddenly, the young woman tightens the hug, hiding her face in his chest, leaving the young man surprised. Very relieved, she cries softly, repeating several times how happy she is that he is safe. Noticing that the little girl is also murmuring similar words of concern, the protagonist feels the weight of that warm reception. Observing the crying of the two, he swears to himself that he will do everything so they never have to be so scared like that again. The day dawns peacefully, illuminating the forest around the small wooden cabin. Already with the daylight, the stranger places the wolf's carcass on a workbench to treat the meat. Without wasting time, he sinks a sharp knife into the animal's belly and begins to pull the hide. But the job proves to be quite exhausting, proving that doing everything alone is harder than watching his grandfather work. Wiping the sweat from his face, Juin cuts a nice piece of meat and decides to try a different method later. Satisfied with the result, he tells himself that it is time to finish the task once and for all. Shortly after, Lizzie appears walking to the exit of the house and calls her husband's name. The young man turns his head upon hearing the sweet voice echoing from outside. Holding a large wooden bucket, she approaches slowly and calls him again calmly. Resting the container on the ground, the woman asks him to put the meat inside it, leaving the big guy a little confused. He quickly assimilates the request through the gestures, understanding that her intention is to collect the catch. Scratching his chin, the protagonist forces his memory, trying to remember how to pronounce the word thank you in that different language. He speaks the term with some difficulty, taking his young wife completely by surprise in the middle of the yard. Lizzie is left without a reaction for a moment, with her cheeks flushed at the sudden thank you. Seeing her silence, the stranger scratches the back of his neck worried, thinking he messed up the pronunciation badly. However, the resident soon smiles amiably and points to herself, confirming the word in a very didactic way. In a quick movement, Juan takes a wide step, closing the distance between the two. He returns the smile and sends a new thank you much more securely and confidently. Replying that it was nothing, the woman looks away, feeling her heart race with the proximity. The young man goes back to storing the meat in the bucket, while the wife adjusts her clothes, quite nervous. Helping with the work, she thinks that she only brought an empty container, not understanding the reason for so much gratitude for something so simple. Crouched side by side, the resident feels embarrassed, remembering that this is the first time experiencing so many new things with someone. Lizzie feels her face burn, remembering the unexpected kiss they exchanged moments ago. Walking back to the house, she tries to deal with the embarrassment that completely consumes her, but curiosity speaks louder. Clasping her hands against her chest, the young woman wonders if the stranger has ever touched other women's lips in the same way. Faced with so many mixed feelings, the young lady feels like crying, feeling her own heart palpitate uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Juan rests his hands on his knees, taking a short break from the heavy work. Observing the scene from afar, she finds his attitude very strange, as women normally take on this role. Carrying 2 wooden bowls, the wife questions why this man acts as if preparing meat is natural. Upon handing over the containers, Lizzie notices her husband leaning towards her without saying absolutely anything. With him getting closer and closer, the young woman panics, believing she will be kissed again in broad daylight. Totally without reaction, she just squeezes her eyes shut, waiting for the sudden touch. The young man's face passes centimeters from her shoulder in a very delicate and affectionate way. Juan deposits a soft kiss on the top of his wife's head, showing genuine affection. Dying of shame for the thoughtless attitude, the big guy steps back, calling himself an idiot and wanting to know why she closed her eyes. An embarrassing silence dominates the place, with the stranger avoiding eye contact while holding the bucket. The young woman holds her own head, terrified for having acted like a desperate person waiting for a kiss on the mouth. Willing to end the misunderstanding, the stranger approaches her again calmly. Determined not to embarrass herself, Lizzie widens her eyes, promising herself to keep them wide open this time. But Juan surprises her by holding her face with both hands and giving a real affectionate kiss. The couple slowly separates, enjoying the moment of pure intimacy. Still a bit spaced out by the situation, the young man grabs the bucket handles and takes a step back, asking for Dorothy. Hidden in the doorframe of the house, the little girl peeks at the two with a look of pure enchantment, having seen the whole display of affection. Completely red upon noticing her daughter, the woman flees, running inside the cabin, completely desperate. Shortly after, the small family walks peacefully through the shaded forest. Leading the group with the heavy bucket, Juan is closely followed by the girl, with the mother bringing up the rear. The big guy smiles, sending a sincere thanks for the help provided. Seeing that the child did not respond, he deduces that the lack of use of her name made it difficult to understand. Stopping in the middle of the path, the protagonist tries again and calls Dorothy clearly, thanking her for the assistance on the trip. Radiant at being called so, the little girl smiles, holding the edge of the container full of energy and pride. Later in the cabin, Lizzie smooths out the enormous animal hide that was stretched out on the living room floor. Sitting at the back of the room, the young man finds it strange that the drying process is happening indoors due to the strong smell the skin exudes. Suddenly, he connects the dots and understands her decision to keep the piece hidden inside. The stranger concludes that the pelt of a beast that size is certainly a valuable item for the family's reserves. Finishing caring for the material, the young woman lifts her body and looks at her daughter playing. Dorothy lies on top of the monstrous snout in a very relaxed way, showing no trace of fear of the creature. The mother lets out a sweet and soft laugh, finding the little girl's tranquility with the slaughtered animal amusing. Juan goes along with the light mood, opening a satisfied smile seeing the family so happy and safe in his presence. The residence exudes calm, isolated amidst the trees under the strong afternoon light. Taking care of the food, Lizzie throws salt over the pieces of red meat, storing the supplies in a larger container. Observing her movements carefully, the protagonist memorizes the preservation technique, intending to take over this task in the future. Happy to have stored the salt, the wife kneads the seasoning into the meat, very relieved with the abundant food available. With his arms crossed, the big guy reflects on the infinity of basic knowledge he needs to master in that place. Staring at the valuable skin on the floor, he decides he will soon learn the rules of buying and trading products in the outside world. Determined to stop just resting, Juin stands up to return to his daily duties. The sudden movement startles Lizzie, who turns around interrupting the meat seasoning, somewhat nervous. Waving gently, the husband asks the young lady to stay seated, ensuring he doesn't intend to interrupt the household chores. Juin waves his hands in denial and guarantees that he has rested enough, so he feels no pain and is perfectly fine now. Reassuring his wife with a gentle touch on her shoulder, he says he won't overdo the exertion and asks her to stop worrying. At this, the stranger turns his back and walks outside, leaving the young woman in silence watching his departure. Already in the middle of the forest, the big guy faces a tree, evaluating that its size seems perfect for training wood cutting. Holding the axe firmly, he remembers that oak is good for the fire, but admits he doesn't even know what one looks like. Even without experience, he fully trusts his own strength. Without wasting time, he delivers a heavy blow against the trunk, scattering wood splinters everywhere. The impact of the blade echoes loudly through the woods, demonstrating the weight of the movement. After a lot of continuous effort, the protagonist wipes the sweat from his forehead panting, needing to lean his body on the tool's handle to rest. Totally exhausted, he realizes in practice that chopping down trees requires much more technique than just using muscles. The late afternoon soon approaches, covering the small wooden cabin with the warm light of the sunset. Opening the house door, Juin enters carrying a basket full of firewood on his back after finishing the day's heavy work. Lizzie widens her eyes, slightly surprised to see her husband arriving, while little Dorothy hides behind her mother. Worried about the weight, the woman quickly runs towards him wanting to help with the load. The young man sits on the floor completely exhausted unloading the wood, but is left confused when his wife kneels by his side. Gently running a cloth over her husband's sweaty face, she cares for him while the big guy tries to say that everything is fine. Thanking her for the care affectionately, he leaves the young woman speechless, just enjoying that quiet moment under Dorothy's watchful eye. Suddenly, the little girl runs hurriedly down the house hallway, stomping her little feet on the wooden floor. She goes to a basin full of clean water and plunges a piece of cloth into it with great enthusiasm. Right after, the child comes running back as fast as she can, dripping water all along the way. In a sudden leap, Dorothy stamps the soaked cloth straight onto the stranger's face, startling the couple with the abrupt attitude. With water running down his hair, Juin is totally frozen in place, not understanding what just happened. Taking the fabric off his face, he notices the girl's good intention while Lizzie panics, waving her hands wanting to apologize. The little girl stares at the man with big, bright eyes, anxiously expecting some positive reaction for her help. Melted by the cuteness, the protagonist gives her a gentle head scratch and sends a very sincere thank you. Excited by the praise, the little one runs back to get more water, making the big guy desperately ask her to stop. Managing to calm the situation, he holds his wife's hands tenderly and confesses that this whole peaceful life seems like just a dream. Until recently, he swore he would never enjoy such happiness, so he wishes to do everything to keep the smile on their faces. Night falls over the forest, bringing a cold breeze, while the tranquil sound of nature surrounds the isolated cabin. Thick smoke rises from the stone chimney, proving that the interior of the residence is very warm and welcoming. Gathered in the middle of the candlelit room, the three share a hearty dinner together for the first time. After the meal, the couple directs their attentive gazes to the opposite side of the room, enjoying the silence. Completely exhausted after a busy day, little Dorothy has already passed out on the floor wrapped in blankets. The husband finds the adorable scene amusing and exchanges a knowing look with his wife. Being very careful not to wake the child, Juin picks her up very delicately. Holding the girl firmly, he waits for the young woman to get ready so they can end the night together. The stranger walks at a slow pace to the made bed near the lit fireplace, keeping the environment very warm. With extreme caution, he places the little girl on the soft mattress and pulls the blanket up to keep her protected from the cold. Outside, darkness dominates the silent forest, leaving only the faint light coming from the house's window. Near the kitchen, Lizzie washes the dinner dishes by dipping the containers in a basin of water. Finishing cleaning the utensils, she feels her husband's presence approaching silently right behind her. The young man reaches out his arm and holds the resident's wrist very softly, preventing her from continuing to work. Surprised by the sudden touch, the young lady turns her body, feeling her heart race and her face flush instantly. Maintaining a calm posture, the protagonist looks into her eyes, waiting for his wife's full attention. Bathed in the room's dim light, the two stand still in the middle of the room in a moment of pure intimacy and tension. Breaking any distance, the big guy pulls her by the waist, enveloping the young woman in a firm and protective hug. Resting his face near her hair, he tightens the hug, enjoying the warmth and peace of that moment. Totally red, Lizzie swallows her own shyness, assuring herself that this is the natural attitude a wife should have. Mustering courage, the young lady raises her trembling hands and touches her husband's chest, sliding her fingers over his clothes. The stranger observes her effort to return the affection, maintaining a calm and understanding look. Happy with the young woman's small initiative, he opens an affectionate smile, feeling his chest warm up. But her courage is short-lived and she turns her face away abruptly, covering her cheeks, unable to withstand the enormous embarrassment. Quickly, Juan holds his wife's hands before she tries to escape the situation again. Keeping the two very close, the young man seeks direct eye contact, leaving the woman even more nervous and vulnerable. Tilting his head, he places a soft kiss on her cheek and calls his wife to go to sleep. The last candle in the room is blown out, plunging the small cabin into the deep shadows of the nocturnal forest. Adjusting the blankets on the floor, the big guy lies down comfortably next to Lizzie to rest together. He rests the unlit lamp in a corner, while the resident observes him silently in the gloom. Covering his own body, the protagonist turns on his side, settling down to finally end that exhausting day. Lying on her back, the woman lets out a long sigh of relief, feeling her face burn with so much happiness. Even with his back turned, Juan keeps his eyes open, focused on his own thoughts while listening to his wife's breathing. Observing the two sleeping peacefully by his side, Juan feels his heart soften at that peaceful scene. Upon accepting that that woman really is his wife, he mentally begs that the two never depart this world before him. Begging any higher power, the young man asks that his new family remain happy until the last day of his life. Far away, in the grand castles of wealthy nobles, people would never understand the reality of living in such a small environment. In the houses of commoners, it is extremely common for all children to grow up sharing the exact same room as their parents. Because of this lack of space, it becomes impossible to hide from the children how an adult couple really spends their nights together. Trapped in her own memories, the young woman remembers her former father's terrifying voice threatening to hit her if she kept crying. Hidden under the covers, little Lizzie spent the early mornings listening to her mother's suppressed crying until dawn. That cruel routine made fear become the most constant feeling throughout her painful childhood. Back in the present, she confesses that she always had dread of inheriting the same miserable fate and living surrounded by sadness. Interrupting the dark thoughts, the resident slowly opens her eyes, feeling a completely new sensation. The relaxing sound of firewood crackling in the fireplace fills the dark room, bringing unexpected comfort. Without understanding when she ended up in the soft bed, the woman is sure she fell asleep lying on the hard floor of the house. Staring at the serene face of her sleeping husband, she emotionally realizes that he even yielded his own arm to serve as a pillow. Cozy and protected, Lizzie hugs the stranger tightly, feeling a true peace she never imagined was possible. The next morning, Juan wakes up hugging the two and feels an enormous relief, confessing that his married nights in the past were never this sweet. Enjoying the warmth of that hug, he is certain that the whole world has been changing for the better since he met this woman. But suddenly, the young man slowly opens his eyes upon hearing a slight movement nearby. He looks down, a little surprised by the scene. Lizzie nestles even deeper into her husband's chest, muttering softly in a cute way, making the big guy feel like his heart is going to explode. With his chest tingling with so much happiness, the stranger wishes from the bottom of his soul that this moment lasts forever. Time passes, and the morning light begins to invade the small cabin through the crack in the window. At this, the protagonist gets up very carefully and covers the two to prevent the cold from entering. Before getting out of bed, he affectionately strokes his wife's head, who lets out a soft murmur, enjoying the touch. A little later, the young woman is already up and walking through the kitchen holding an empty bucket to start the day's chores. However, she gets a big scare when someone suddenly grabs the bucket's handle. Turning around startled, she realizes it's just her husband wanting to help with the chores. Without making any effort, the young man lifts a huge cauldron and pours all the heavy water at once. He then looks at his wife and says something in a totally unknown language. The woman fails to understand a single word of what he just said. Noticing the confusion, Juin asks if she slept well, calling the young lady darling, which leaves her face boiling and totally frozen. She nods very quickly, while the young man wonders if it was the way he called her that caused all this nervous reaction. Searching his memory, he remembers that he learned some words like wife and darling recently with another resident of the region. Previously, the stranger had asked what he should call the young woman, suggesting using her own name, but only received silence. At that time, Lizzie was dying of shame and asked in her native language to be called darling, making it finally dawn on the husband. Decided to test the theory, he calls her darling once more and the resident hides her face burning with shame. Unable to handle the pressure, the young lady turns her back, trying to compose herself from the heart attack. Thinking that attitude is the cutest thing in the world, the protagonist feels a huge urge to tease his wife a little more. He points to her back and asks his darling to look at him, making the young lady jump with fright. But right on time, little Dorothy jumps out from under the covers, just waking up and full of energy. The little girl looks at nothing with a sleepy face and starts drooling, imagining a nice piece of meat flying in front of her. Without thinking twice, the child throws herself on the floor on her belly, already crawling to fetch her food. She gets up and runs around the house, while the big guy greets her, calling her by name. But the girl passes straight by, ignoring the couple completely, leaving Juin looking like a fool. With her eyes shining with hunger, the little one screams, demanding to eat meat early in the morning. Clinging to the wooden bucket, the child keeps stomping her feet, demanding her food, while the parents laugh at the scene. Finding that much energy amusing, the young man repeats the request, trying to calm the starving little girl. However, Dorothy almost climbs entirely into the bucket, swinging her little legs and screaming nonstop. Laughing out loud at the situation, the protagonist decides it's time to work hard on hunting to feed his new family. Later, he walks peacefully through the dense forest, prepared to face another giant wolf if necessary. Evaluating the sharp axe in his hand, the stranger is confident for finally having brought a real weapon to the woods. He continues advancing through the trees, stepping firmly on the dirt ground. Suddenly, the hunter stops walking upon noticing that the surrounding environment has become bizarrely dark. Looking around, he wonders where that heavy atmosphere is coming from. Clenching the axe handle tightly, the young man feels a bizarre shortness of breath, even being in the middle of such a vast place. With a closed expression, Juin is already mentally preparing himself, imagining what kind of monster is going to jump in front of him now. But instead of a roar, he hears calm and rhythmic footsteps approaching along the trail. The big guy is confused and focuses his vision on the mysterious figure that has just emerged from the shadows of the forest. A man covered by a dark cloak walks towards him without showing any hurry. Revealing himself to be an older, bearded gentleman, the stranger stares at the protagonist with a deep and mysterious look. Feeling the strong tension of the moment, Juin breaks into a cold sweat facing that presence and mentally wonders who that mysterious guy could be.